Well, thanks. It's great to be here, and I'm glad that some of you got some beer. That way you can enjoy this a little bit better with downing a beer and having a pretzel. And again, I'm going to talk a little bit about nuts and bolts. It's interesting when you say monetizing. I'm going to try to give you some of my experience of how I, over 25 years, have done this. In disclosure, I've been working on one little device, and I did not take Kurt's recommendation of having a large market device, because I'm in a very tiny orphan disease market device for many years. We're expanding a little bit. So I had a technology for 4 years I worked on before we had a company. So I'm the founder and board member of this company. I've actually spent $70 million on this device over 20 years. Some of it, I count everything, NIH grants, some other grants, angel investors. We've invested almost all of our earnings over the years. Even this day, with about $5 to $7 million a year, we go back into R&D for our own company and manufacturing and stuff. But it's a small company. I've been involved with multiple other companies over the years, like anybody else is up here. The company that I'm disclosing is Synapse Biomedical. You'll see two devices there, my chronic device. And last year during the COVID pandemic, I have a research unit in Madrid and in Italy, so I knew very early. I was actually over there working on ICU research in January of 2020, so I kind of knew quickly. So I worked with FDA, and I got emergency use authorization for my newest device, which is a temporary diaphragm pacing that we got through the FDA, and actually just got a breakthrough technology designation from the FDA in July on this type of work to get people off the ventilators faster. So that's been a lot of my work recently, and that's a much larger market opportunity as opposed to spinal cord injury, my initial market, which is about 1,000 patients a year, about 100,000 patients go on a ventilator. So kind of looking at what you do in your innovation and what's going to happen with that. Disclosure number 2 is that you always have to disclose. And I actually, everybody talks about, working for a company, and make sure that any of your patients can go to a website and know exactly what you get paid from that company in about 30 seconds. And so make sure you tell everybody that you're going to work with. So here's my last 5 years that I actually put on the slide this morning, my open payments out of my company. So some years it was better, other years it wasn't. But you have to disclose that to everybody, anytime, anywhere you do it, because anybody can now go and look at what you get paid. Interesting, stock options don't show up there. They're supposed to, but they really don't show up in openpayments.gov. You're supposed to report that, but people don't really. It's hard to search it for that. Disclosure number 3 is disclose to your patients that you're an innovator. And this is actually from my consents. Whenever I implant patients with my own device, I have a special consent that my hospital actually has IP on this, my university has IP, and you can read it goes very specifically on what I have there. And so every patient has to know, and I make sure whenever I do procedures with my own device is that somebody else gets the consent so that I don't pressure them. Surprisingly, most patients like innovators, and they actually want to go, and patients may travel a long distance for their rare disease to have the person who developed it and innovated it do it. But it's always safe to disclose to everybody, anytime, always, so that you don't get caught, because some newspaper reporter may actually eventually put it on the front page of the Plain Dealer in Cleveland or somewhere else. But if you disclose, it works out. I'm going to have some disclaimers here, because monetizing, and this is kind of pointers, is that obviously you want to earn something out of your innovation. We all do it to help patients, but we do know it's time. I'm going to give you some pointers of what I do. But remember, I'm not a financial planner. I'm not an expert in IRS tax rulings. I'm going to show you some of the stuff that I've done for to decrease tax burdens over the year. I have an accountant. I'm not a lawyer. I employ many lawyers, and this is kind of my corporate lawyer is $300 an hour. And we utilize that person very commonly. I have an IP lawyer that's $600 an hour, Jim Shea out of San Francisco, very good in technology. I've kept track for over 20 years how much I've paid my IP lawyer. That's $1.2 million over 20 years. And there's that question earlier about who owns your IP. I'm one of these interesting persons, I think I'll show this on a later slide, is that I negotiated that all my IP goes to my company. And remember, and everybody says, if you have IP, when you work for a company, that company owns your IP, and you get no royalties. So I have about 10 of my patents are through my company. So at one point in time when I was the highest producer for my hospital clinically, and we had a weird, even though I was a fully academic person, our division actually was incorporated at the university, and so the university didn't pay me, and the hospital didn't pay me, and then that went bankrupt during the malpractice crisis. As the highest producer for my hospital in general surgery, they wanted to get me to sign the new contract and become an employee, and my lawyers were just a little bit smarter than their lawyers, and that all my IP that had anything to do with the diaphragm went to my company. But again, the IP with the company I'm not going to get royalties out of that, but that's a valuation in my company. So I may be one of these rare ones that actually negotiated the IP that I own in any neurostim, actually, any type of neurostim. So I have some other devices that are stroke related now that's unrelated to this area. And then FDA regulatory lawyers is even more expensive. I go with Lovell and Howell's, big firm in Washington, D.C., and they kind of have the insight, but they're $850 an hour. We do a lot of our FDA regulatory out process, and there's always two of them. So that's like an expensive hour when they say, let's talk about one more thing. I'm like, come on, that's another $1,500 and stuff. Or when I'm sitting at the FDA, when we used to do in-person things, and then the FDA said, let's just talk a little bit more. I'm sitting there with two lawyers. Man, this is gonna be another $1,500 because you're asking me extra questions. But they're worth it if you get the right ones, and I've switched lawyers for my regulatory over the years. Now, basic of monetizing, I was trying to give that some pointers. There's late cash and there's early cash, right? And so we all want to know, and I think in my conclusion, it's not immoral to make money off of your innovation. It's not illegal either. And obviously late cash, and I'll talk about each of these a little bit in my time here. There's long-term IP royalties, equity in company, and stock options. And obviously early cash is just outright selling your IP early, which your university may do. They may just want to get that upfront cash and not have to worry about royalties. Then there's what I call early cash, and sometimes in all my young people, I mean, Speakers Bureau would be early cash. You get paid for the consultant advisor. And then I'll talk a little about academic advancement. I'm going to actually show you what we do in our department because we paid people differently. And if you're an innovator, you're going to get promoted, which is cash, basically. But remember, I think everybody said here, there's many, many years before there's any cash. And IP royalties, always, there's a team in patents. Everybody says, I'm gonna get a patent. Remember, royalties is split. It's very rare that anybody gets a patent all by themselves because you have engineers, and I have a team. So most of my patents have about 5 or 6 people. And early on, before there's a company, I had my grad students, PhD students, I was working with our engineering department. So there's always about 4 or 5 people on some of our patents early on. When employed by a company, as mentioned, they own the IP. I have about 10 other patents with my company, Synapse Biomedical. I wouldn't get royalty for that. That'd just be catching out. In universities and hospitals, they all have that to align everybody. Even when I hire somebody from my community hospitals, we own their IP. Nowadays, it's on every hospital contract. And I have 3 patents that were early on before there's a company, and that's where I had engineers. So that's with various patents I have. Now, this is my IP royalties. Everybody says, you're gonna get royalties forever. And that the university, it's gonna be great, they're gonna share it with you. But the universities take out. So I know what I pay the university, and this is actually during a down year, 2020, the last half of the years. And I paid the university, based on our net revenues, $110,000 in royalties. And I kind of on the bottom of that, and what did I get back after I paid them $110,000? I got back as my shares $5,000 because there's all these other rules. There's just a 15% administrative fee, and then I work with the VA, the hospital, the university. I'll take a cut, as you can see there. Technology transfer office just gets a cut for, what you don't see is that which somebody talked about earlier, the legal expenses, some of our patents are so old, there's no other legal expenses that I've already paid that off. So there's a line there you can see. And this is kind of real world data. So I mean, yeah, you might get royalties, but may not be that big eventually. Equity of a company is just the other way. It's kind of as we, again, as talk about the late cash, as I founded my company, Synapse Biomedical, with, I always like to joke, is at one point in time, because a university had a piece of it, my hospital had a piece. At one point in time, I owned 45% of my company, right? And so it only goes down. In full disclosure, I still own about 11% of my company, which is, if you know startups, you can talk to people, that's still a fairly high percentage of ownership that I actually have in that company. And I think I love that line you said in there, that Steve, actually, you have to have some skin in the game. So obviously early on in my VCs, I invested in the company myself. I put money in the company. The VCs want to know if we're doing another round of financing, are you going to put money in to maintain? Yes, I am. If you don't, then one of the founders, why is he not putting, what does he know that he's not telling us because he's not putting his own cash in that? And young surgeons, it's hard. If you have many of our graduates, as we know, have, $500,000 in debt, and then somebody says, your innovation, put a couple thousand, and you don't have money. So it gets a little bit more difficult. And I always like to say is that if people are familiar with the VC rounds, is every round of VC has different rules on who has the first out, right? And so I always, and I've gone through several rounds, no rounds of investors for several years now, but you always want to put some money in because then you have some say in those shares. Every share has different voting rights if you've been in this game long enough. And you don't want to get diluted too much. And so I'm still not that diluted. And again, we've kind of mentioned, to get a medical device through the FDA is roughly going to be about $100 million. So you do need a lot of cash. And so I've gotten 2 devices through the FDA under the HDE program for less than 50 million combined. I have another device I'm budgeting about 100 million to get through the FDA on now. But it's, every year when I do taxes, my financial planner says, boy, you are really overexposed with one non-liquid stock. So my company is still not liquid. We're not on the stock exchange. We're still privately held, roughly. So whatever that value is, we don't know. Kind of own the shares, how much I own, what that is. That could be 11% of 100,000. It could be 11% of 100 million. 200 million, who knows? You always have these ideas early on that you're going to cash out, but over the years, those goes up and down as things. I survived 2008 when I had a 30 million term sheet, but then that money evaporated. It's so good that AirSeal kept their money going in there. I wasn't able to close that round of financing in 2008. And really at the end of 2008, I was actually down. I had mortgaged my house to keep the company alive. If you're in this long enough, you'll realize that if you pay people but you can't pay your taxes, that's illegal. And so you have to have some money. And there's certain things you have to do to maintain a company. We had to kind of lay off roughly about 50% of our company back then in 2008 and the market crash and everything. So now I survived the pandemic. I was going to do a product launch in Japan and South Korea in the second quarter of 2020. Guess where I've not gone since that quarter? And if anybody's ever gotten a device into Japan, I invested several $1 million to get through their version of the FDA, and then I still have yet to make a sale into Japan or South Korea, 2 of the largest economies because of this. So things come and go with that, but equity in the company is important to have, and I always like to tell early innovators, if you can form that company, it's kind of fun to have a company. Stock options is interesting. I think we're kind of joking. I think we all have various options as advisors, and I don't even know what happens with them. And stock options sound good. Interesting if you think about the tax burden. If you get stock, options. There's a little bit of financial thing you have to do, but you don't have to pay taxes on that because it's just options until you cash out, and then it's actually capital gains, which is a little bit different. That may change, and when you cash out of a company now, because capital gains may be changing a little bit. But it's all non-liquid. Stock options are usually startup companies. It's never going to be liquid, and really, it's maybe meaningless or nothing. And stock options that they give surgeons who help to design, there's an advisory board, that gets diluted extremely rapidly. So it's great to have some, and it looks good, but it's nice, but it's not there. This is something that we talk about a little bit about promotion. This is, I don't know if I'm allowed to do this. I actually have exactly what I pay my faculty based on the assistant first associate professor. So you can actually look at that as you get promoted, innovators can get promoted. We think in our university, a patent's actually probably worth about 5 articles, roughly, and that's how we'll do that. If you actually truly have intellectual property on something, we put you up higher because we have a very significant how you can get promoted based on articles published. And actually, as you're an innovator, you get national reputation, which adds for promoting. But you can look at roughly in the 50th percentile of RVUs. If you get promoted, you're basically getting a $100,000 pay raise. So, I mean, that's a significant pay raise. So I like to say, some people say, actually, getting promoted is almost more important than going up to 75th or 80th, doing an extra 5,000 RVUs. So in my junior faculty, I'm not sure you might say this, that you can do all these cases, but if you don't get promoted, I'm not going to give you as much of a pay raise. So go out there and do some innovation, do some stuff, and then you get promoted, you're going to get a much bigger pay raise in our academic way. So it's something that you look at on innovations and IP and what you're doing, and having a national representation helps in your academic promotion if you're in the academics. Then this is kind of the Consulting and Speakers Bureau. I mean, some people think that's terrible. We all have to disclose it, but if you don't have IP, but you can use a device better than anybody else, that's of value for you. So you're kind of the innovator, you're the first to use the new robot or something, and the first to do that. You'll be asked to be on the boards of these small companies because they know you're an innovator, that you've done this before. And then everybody says, well, how much do you charge? That's just great big secrets. I'm going to tell you exactly what I charge my own companies. And that if you all have a paycheck somewhere, and there's always, even if you're academic, there's an hourly rate in there somewhere. I always charge companies less than that hourly rate so that, one, if I'm ever audited, it comes out is I'm actually charging that company less than I make in that hourly rate. So I basically came up with this thing is you don't want to be greedy, greedy because it can come out. I mean, newspapers are always looking to make doctors look bad, and it's less than what I get paid on my pay stub. So I'm not making more money than I make in my clinical practice, which, as we know in surgeons, I have a paper I presented in Central Surgical. For our 3 most common operations over the last decade, with inflation, we get about 10% less income on it on Medicare. But you need to keep track of these hours, and it's very important so that, one, again, just for your own knowledge, that I don't want to be charging a company when I'm doing a case with that device, because that doesn't look good. I don't charge my company when I'm seeing patients or operating anywhere. I don't charge when I'm presenting. I do keep track, and it's important to have that. It's saved me at times with my compliance officer, because there's always new compliance. I've been at the same institution now for 25 years. There's always a new compliance officer that's looking for somebody that's doing something, and I actually have this log. I keep it. I know when I do my hours. I know what I get paid. This is in December of that. Proctoring a patient in Japan, which is probably 2 in the morning. Weekends, I might have more hours. When I go somewhere and work, it'll be there. It comes in. And so my IRBs wanted to see that when I'm working on my I have like 15 IRB protocols, that I'm not charging my company when I'm doing something with my IRB. And so that's my own way of doing it. And if you're doing a consultant, I'd recommend you kind of keep track of your hours. And if you're getting $10,000 to go talk to a company, that may get disclosed. Anybody can go look right now. You can Google me, anybody up here, and know exactly what they get paid by these companies. It's all public knowledge. And then the other things, even as a finance, I call 1099 income, right? You get paid by this company, you get this extra income, which I think is very important to have in our practice, because I can use that money for other things. Obviously, I can use that money to pay expenses that aren't covered by my hospital CME, or if you're out in private practice, to help pay for other things that'll decrease that. That's a business expense, even if you're an employee for somewhere else, and therefore it can decrease the liability on this. I have a home office that my accountant has. That's why I subtract for all my expenses of my house. That'll go out of my 1099 income. So it's nice to have something where you have that extra money to play with. You can have a separate SEP IRA, so eventually you can retire, as we all want to do at some point in time. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. When my kids were young, if you ever looked at some talks I gave, my kids were models. I always had a picture of my kid in my talk. So, you can pay your kids out of your 1099 money and then put it in an IRA to pay for their college. So it's other ways of maximizing and decreasing your tax burden. Again, talk to your own tax attorney. Don't trust me on this. It is legal. You can't pay them a lot, but a couple $1,000s a year, nobody's going to know. And it's something you can do. Some way of innovators. You do want to make sure that you're financially savvy enough that you can utilize what you're using. And I told them I was going to go quick, and I can open up for questions. I could talk for hours about my experience, but you heard from some great people already in here. But we really innovate to help patients, and that's really what you want to do. I started in this diaphragm pacing and get people off the ventilator, and if you don't know my story, my second patient I ever operated on was Christopher Reeve, Superman, and I didn't kill him. And I was like, what if you kill Superman? I go, there'd be no diaphragm pacing company, but you got to make sure. And remember, profiting from your innovation is not illegal or immoral, even though people say we're all greedy doctors and stuff, but you have to disclose. I may go overboard with disclosing, keep my own hours, but if I'm ever audited, or somebody comes in, or our local newspaper sees I made $200,000 for my company, and the State Board of Ohio once wanted to check because they heard I was selling my own device, and I showed them the consent and everything else. So my state board once investigated me to make sure I wasn't doing this illegally. And it can take years and years and years. But you do want to, because my goal when I hire a young surgeon is to know what's your plan, and a young innovator, what do you want to do? We all work weekends and nights and stuff, but we do know, and this pandemic has shown us that you don't want to overwork. Yes, I've done weekends, nights. I've traveled, some years 200,000 miles a year and everywhere and stuff. I once gave a talk where I talked about washable underwears when I travel so much and I didn't really come back. But you do want quality of your life and work balance. Innovation can be fun. It's fun to talk to people up here. It's fun to do something else at times and go to meetings. It's fun to help people. So you may not make a fortune. Most of us have never really profited out of innovations, but we are helping patients. And really, at least my area, I've operated on thousands of patients to get them off the ventilator, and it really changes their life. Last year in the midst of the COVID pandemic, I went down and I was in our NICU to get kids off the ventilator. I've now implanted this diaphragm pacing on 5 kilogram 8-week-olds and stuff. So anything we can do to get somebody off the ventilator. I can tell you this is that, and the FDA knows I operate on children. I actually redid the FDA paperwork for HCE orphan devices, and you can use some of these devices on children as long as you do certain documentations and stuff. So we've utilized some of our technology on children as young as 8 weeks old and stuff. But it really changes everything, and I think I'll kind of close here, and I'm sure there'll be a session here that we'll talk a little bit more, but it's great to see everybody here looking innovation. Hopefully you may have learned something from my little monetizing. I was trying to give you some nuts and bolts of what I do. I disclosed to you actually what I pay myself, but you could have looked it up on Open Payments anyhow, and how I charge companies I do consulting for to make sure it's above the board, and that's what we want to do. And sometimes being a consultant is great fun, and you will get paid for it. Just don't make it where you look too greedy and somebody else will find out and report you and stuff. So with that, I'll close, and we'll continue on with this great session that you've put on here.